Colm Bairéad, welcome to our cinema, and thank you so much for your wonderfully gentle yet very emotional film. I think the hall was quite in tears now at the end titles.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It looks like such a beautiful venue as well. From what I can see on this here, it looks like really special theater.
It is, and the film looks beautiful watching it here. I have invited the public, of course, to ask a question or tell you something about the film, but perhaps let us start. I would like to ask you, as this was your first feature film, you have worked a lot in television, also documentary, also you have made several shorts, but for the first feature you have chosen a story that reveals many themes, I would say, like, I don't know, feelings in childhood, feelings of abandonment, a family, or mourning a person who passes, or a child even. What was the theme that you wanted to address, or was it all of this? What was the thing about the story that was the most important for you when you started working?
Well, I mean, all of the things that you've highlighted were certainly a consideration. I mean, I suppose this is my first feature film, as you say, but all of my short films prior to this have all dealt with the theme of family in some way, and also the theme of loss. I'm not entirely sure why, but the stories that I'm kind of drawn to are often deal with grief in some way. So when I read Claire Keegan's Foster, which is the story that this film is based on, I was immediately drawn to it because it's very much an interrogation of the whole idea of family, and it also has this sort of terrible tragedy that's at the heart of it, but that's completely silent in a way. The death of the Kinsela's son is never actually spoken about by any of the main characters other than the nosy neighbor. And I loved that it was a story about this, and yet it wasn't sort of tackling it head on. It was something that informed the subtext of everything. And I really enjoyed that restraint that Claire had created in the original. And I thought it would be a fascinating challenge to try and bring that to the big screen. And also because, it was a story. I was strangely drawn to the story because it was a very small story in one sense, that it's almost like a miniature. And it's a story that's not reliant on plot. Plot is almost secondary, a secondary consideration in the story. And I'm kind of a believer in the idea that's if you look kind of closely enough and openly enough at a small thing, that you can see a great deal in it. And Foster, the story that I'm referring to, felt like it was one of those creations. There was a sort of a humility to it, I think, in terms of its narrative, and yet at the same time it had a kind of a hugeness to it also. It was I guess sometimes I like to think of it as like the way a childhood memory can be this tiny thing, but for the person to whom the memory belongs, it can actually be huge and hugely meaningful. And that was how I felt about the source material.
Perhaps to say that the story, the novella you adapted the screenplay from is English language. So obviously, let's say translating it to Irish Gaelic is one of the major adaptations. Would you say that you made any other such major adaptations, bringing it on film?
I would say the other the major change, like if you were to read Foster, the story begins with the young girl already in her father's car on the way to the Kinsellas. So, and that's kind of the end of the first act of our film. So I had to, in some senses, I had to invent the sort of opening act of the film because I felt it was important that the audience, uh, um, would get a sense of the environment that she's come from. Because what happens in the book is written in the first person, so you're inside the mind of this young girl. So when she arrives at the Kinsellas' home for the summer, there are moments where she will reference, there might be just a sentence or two sentences where she'll reference something from her past, from her home life. You know, she mentions, for instance, like her remembering her mother writing the letter to the Kinsellas asking could they take her for the summer, little details like that. But I felt, you know, if you were to transpose that exactly to the screen, that would kind of involve the use of flashbacks of some sort, or voiceover narration, and I felt that that would be slightly inelegant as a device. I wanted the film to be a sort of a straight line that the audience experiences, and that the audience is in the shoes of this young girl over the course of the film. So for me, it was a question of taking any of those little moments that the girl references in the source material where she talks about her family or her mother or her siblings. And I sort of built the opening act of the film from these morsels that Claire had sort of left peppered throughout the original story. So in a way, hopefully, in a way, what the audience who watches the film ends up doing is almost similar to what the girl or the narrator in the story does, which is the audience almost has those moments where they can compare and contrast the environment that she's been sent to and the environment that she's come from.
As you
But then
mentioned,
also as you say, the Irish language element was another kind of major difference. I mean, major in one sense, but in another way, to me, it felt quite apt to tell this story in the Irish language because, you know, for me, the Foster, the original story is a very truthful portrait of us as a people, of the Irish kind of way of being, and the sort of emotional temperature of us as a people, and our psychological and emotional makeup. It felt very authentic in terms of how it rendered us. So for me, it was always quite apt to take that story and to tell it through our own indigenous language, you know. And even though like the Irish language is the official language of Ireland, if you come here, you know, you'll see the Irish language is written on all of the road signs, and it's on your driver's license, and it's on official government documents, but always side by side with English. But the truth is that the form of English that we speak in Ireland is sort of haunted by the fact that we used to speak this entirely different language. So the English that's spoken in Ireland is called Hiberno English, and that's a description of a form of English that's been sort of shaped to some degree by the fact that we used to speak this other language, and that was sort of incorporated into some of the syntax of how we speak English and some of the pronunciations and so forth. So when I read Foster, for instance, the original story, I can see as an Irish speaker, particularly in the dialogue between the characters, I can see the Irish language sort of hiding in a sense, or sort of fossilized in a way into the way that the people are communicating.
as you have mentioned that the novella is written in first person, also the film seems to be directed, so we perceive it as being in first person of the girl. Would you tell us a little bit about what were your what was the frame that you decided to direct in? What were your, I don't know, dialogues with the director of photography? And so to make this such a world of the girl.
Yeah, we were trying to, as you say, kind of emulate, you know, what Claire Keegan had done in Foster, which was to write in the first person. So I kind of knew from the beginning that because this was a film that rely on its plot as the most compelling element. I knew that the question of point of view and the question of placing the audience into the shoes of the young girl was going to be extremely important, in terms of sort of making it compelling, I suppose, to an audience. And it was sort of a gamble in a way, or a belief that an audience would engage with the material on the basis that it would sort of stoke up their own memories of what it feels like to be a child, and what it feels like to be stuck in the backseat of a car and not quite knowing where you're going, or not knowing who these other adults are, or what, you know, what their world is in a way. And the sort of tools that we use to achieve that were, you know, oftentimes quite simple, in terms of we would try and keep the camera at the level of the eye level of the girl, of course. We would try and have the camera to sort of stay within her proximity. So for instance, like a good example of that would be the car scenes, actually, when she's traveling to the Kinselas or traveling home towards the end of the film, that the camera never leaves the back seat of the car. So I knew, because I had a very solid idea that I wanted the film to be from this girl's perspective, I knew that I would never need any kind of big wide shots of the countryside with the car kind of driving through, or drone shots or anything like that. I knew that the camera needed to stay with her at all times, so that the audience would be aligned with this point of view, and also with their memory of what it feels like to be a child, in a way. And then even the aspect ratio that we chose, which is, apparently your screen is the right shape for our aspect ratio, so I would have really liked to have seen that. But we chose that aspect ratio because it felt appropriate for this younger point of view that we were presenting. We liked the idea that there were things kind of just outside of frame that she couldn't see, you know, that there were a sense that this is a kind of a consciousness that hasn't figured the world out yet completely, and that there are things just beyond her grasp or beyond her understanding. And it felt sort of, myself and Kate McCullough, the cinematographer, we used to talk a lot about trying to create a sort of naivety to the images. And again, that aspect ratio, it obviously belongs to another time in terms of cinema as well, an older time, and perhaps more innocent time in some ways, and a time when cinema was in its own infancy, or its own early adolescence, perhaps. So it just felt like an appropriate way of framing the story, and again, it was all of these aesthetic choices are guided by that understanding that we're trying to push the film into a kind of a first person mode, and place the audience in this girl's shoes.
While watching the film, I was thinking that because of the authenticity that you have already mentioned, but also the authenticity of the, I would say, action of the surroundings and so on, you're definitely in the realm of realism, but taking it also into impressionism a lot, with the sunlight, going through, or the woods being or scary or very non-scary, but the same shot, with the light doing something that explains the state of the girl. So it's quite wonderful. I would like to ask the public if they have a question. Ma kdo kakšno vprašanje morda? Ali pa kakšno misel? Bom se še vrnila k vam, ker razmislite, bo zanimiv. Perhaps Catherine Clinch, the girl who plays Coit, is wonderful. She's wonderful to watch at every moment. How did you find her? Did you have an idea how you want her to look, or did she give you the idea how she will look?
Yeah, no, we didn't have any kind of criteria for how she should look. We knew that we were looking for someone kind of 9, 10 years of age. And I suppose that the first challenge, if you make a film in the Irish language, the challenge you have is that even though, as I said earlier, it is our national language, it's the language of the state, it's not very widely spoken. It's very much a minority language. And it's actually on UNESCO's endangered languages list. So it's, Ireland is a small country anyway, so the sort of number of actors that you have is relatively small. But then when you add in the criteria of being able to speak Irish, then that pool of actors becomes smaller again. However, when you're looking for a child actor, you're usually looking for an unknown. You're not usually going to an agent to who will have a big roster of child actors. So luckily in Ireland there is a system within the education system. There are a number of schools where all of the subjects are taught through the Irish language. So you have a sort of a pool of young people for whom the Irish language is a normal part of their school life, and they're fluent in the language. So we very much focused on that network of those schools around the country, where you had these young people who could speak the language. And that's where we ultimately found Catherine Clinch. I mean, it took a while. It took us 7 months, I think, in total before we found her. And that was delayed a little because COVID arrived. Like, we started pre-COVID, and then COVID arrived, and that kind of slowed everything down. And we had to change from, in-person auditions to self-tapes. People sent in their videos of themselves. And yeah, one day we got a video from Catherine Clinch, and yeah, it was just extraordinary. It was my wife, who's actually the producer of the film. She saw the tape first, and I was out of the house at the time, and she just rang me and she's like, "Colm, you need to come home and see this tape. There's something really remarkable here." And yeah, it was. I remember looking at Catherine's tape and just being I just leaning in always to it, because there was something so magnetic about her performance and about what she was concealing. She seemed to have this really wonderful understanding of the character in terms of that this was someone who's kind of learned to shut herself down or hide herself from the world around her. But then in a sort of contradictory sense, she also had this wonderful openness to allow the camera to witness that, because the performance is one thing, but then you have to be comfortable to allow yourself to be seen in that kind of vulnerable state. And she just had both of those things. And we kind of knew, or we had a very strong feeling, at least from just seeing that tape, that we had found our court. And then we did what's called a chemistry read, which is where you take your actors. So we had Carrie Crowley and Andrew Bennett, who play the foster parents. We had them pretty much cast. So we got them into a room with Catherine and to see how they would play off each other. And that was a very exciting day. I always remember leaving that day with Cleona, my wife, and we were driving home, and we were just so excited, because we just knew we had found the sort of holy trinity that the film needed. And that's always such an exciting moment. You kind of can't wait to get started, because you feel like there's all this magic that you just want to capture. So yeah, Catherine was really just extraordinary, and she sort of set the she sort of set the tone for the film itself in a way. You know, her performance was, because we would have shot camera tests with her as well, you know, prior to filming. And I feel like looking back at it now, I do feel like it even informed the sort of stillness of the film, and just the energy, her energy and her performance sort of seeped into all of the other elements, I feel. So she was kind of our guiding light, I think, in the making of the film.
How did you prepare her for the shooting? Was it more talking about the content of the film or about her character, or was it more working on actions, because there is a lot of action, not so much dialogue, hence The Quiet Girl?
Yeah, it was sort of a mixture. I mean, you know, from my experience, like all of my short films, actually, bar one, have all been centered on young protagonists. So I've kind of worked with quite a number of child actors. Um, and it's funny, like when you're working with a child actor, you're essentially working with a non-actor in a sense, because, you know, Catherine herself had no acting experience, certainly not on camera. Um, so for me, it's always a question of just trying to simplify everything and keep things um, as uncomplicated as possible, you know, to give a sort of a focus for the for each scene, but not to try and overcomplicate or over-explain certain things. But having said that, Catherine would arrive with a very kind of deep understanding of the scenes and of the characters. She's a highly intelligent and highly emotionally intelligent young girl. Um, so in some senses, it was in the instance of working with Catherine, it was almost comparable to working with an adult actor. Um, in that she would occasionally surprise me by what she might say about how the character might be feeling about something, or but that said, I still tried to keep it as sort of simple as possible, and my one sort of note that I would always tell her was to not be afraid to hide how she's feeling, because that's what the character is doing for the most part. Um, and in fact, what most people do in real life, we generally spend our lives, you know, not sort of presenting our true feelings about a given situation. We're quite attuned to this idea of wearing masks in real life. So I think the performances in general are sort of informed by that same understanding, you know, and a real commitment to a kind of a naturalism um, that I hope has translated into the finished film.
Perhaps a question from the audience, kakšno vprašanje mogoče o filmu, o načinu dela, kakšno mnenje? Aha. Ne sliši se mikrofona za publiko.
Me slišite? Okay, hi. I just wanted to ask, because Claire Keegan is like a national treasure. How was it working on a story of hers? Did she have any input or any requests that she wanted for the adaptation?
Yeah, Claire was remarkable. I mean, she's remarkable anyway, as you point out. Like she's one of our great writers. So from my point of view, as someone, you know, who had never made a feature film before, you know, I kind of like we approached her agent, and you know, I read Foster in 2018 for the first time, and it was published in 2010, so it had been out in the world for 8 years at that point. So, you know, when I approached her agent, I kind of figured, oh, the rights to this are, you know, most likely gone, which was heartbreaking to me because, you know, I had fallen so kind of deeply in love with the material. But then you know, miraculously, the rights were actually available. And even more miraculously, Claire agreed to giving us the rights, you know, even though I had no particular sort of track record, certainly not in feature films that I could point to. And, you know, we were very open about the fact that this was going to be an Irish language film. And really, like, you know, before this film, like, our film has, you know, thankfully it's done very well. But before this film, there was no precedent for an Irish language film that had any kind of commercial success. So, you know, it was, to me, I was always amazed that she never had any issue with that, or never, you know, never kind of questioned it at all. She seemed quite open to that idea. And then the other kind of remarkable thing was that she was extraordinarily gracious in terms of how she handed the material over, in that she never demanded to see the drafts of the script. She never, you know, demanded to know, you know, who was being cast, or she essentially gave me total freedom. And she said that once the rights had, all the kind of legal stuff had been sort of secured and everything, she did write me a note just saying, you know, the material is yours now, and you need to take it and do with it what you must to bring it to the screen. And she said, you know, I'm here if you have any questions, but really was very respectful of the process, and of granting me this sort of freedom, in a sense, to try and bring her work to screen. Now, I did have to write, you know, in the initial stages, I did have to write to her and sort of outline my vision for the adaptation, and you know, I was obviously professing my love for her work, and was, you know, letting her know that I really wanted to remain as truthful and as close as possible to the source material. So, you know, I imagine that was perhaps of initial comfort, you know, that she felt, okay, that I wasn't going to do anything crazy with her material. So but yeah, I'll always be grateful to her that she was so kind of respectful and gracious in how she handed me her baby, in a sense.
Še kakšno vprašanje mogoče? Perhaps the film is set in the early 80s. Of course, some circumstances are quite different now as they were. There were even more children in families, probably. Do the 80s mean something to you? Was it something that you related to in any way, the time of the happening?
Well, the film is set in 1981, which is the year I was born. So that was always kind of a sort of a neat detail that I enjoyed. But yeah, I mean, I grew up, yeah, in the 80s. I grew up in Dublin, which is the capital city, so I didn't have a rural upbringing, but I would have had, as most Irish people would, I had sort of connections to rural life through extended family, and would have spent time on farms and in the countryside with relatives. And that kind of world felt sort of, it felt like very familiar, but also kind of exotic in a sense, you know, having grown up in a housing estate. So yeah, and yeah, I mean, you know, I'd be younger, obviously, than, say, the central character, but not by so much. Like the world of the film still feels very relatable to me. Like I can remember a lot of that detail, because as was always the case, and still is the case, I guess, to some degree, like particularly in rural Ireland, that there are always things that hang on longer, in a sense. So when you're in the 1980s, you've still got elements of the 70s and the 60s that are still very palpable, and then elements of the 80s that kind of persevere into the 90s and so forth. So the world still felt very, very familiar to me. But at the same time, like we weren't too hung up on making a big deal of the sort of period element of it, you know. We didn't want to sort of fetishize the past in a sense. So even though we were very much committed to it being an authentic portrayal of Irish life at the time, we were in a strange way less interested in that. We were very much concerned about the emotional dynamics of the film. But then ironically, particularly in Ireland, the film has become a real like people point to so much of this sort of detail in the film as, oh, everyone knows that carpet or those the sort of plates that they have in the farm, and there's so many details that Irish people have a very kind of emotional attachment to that. So that's been kind of interesting to observe. But yeah, I mean, as you say, I feel like in my lifetime, having been born in 1981, I feel like my lifespan to date has sort of straddled two very different Irelands, you know. Like Ireland today is far more progressive, and it's a very different country to what it was when I was born. And I'm kind of fascinated. I am fascinated by that Ireland that I was born into, and that was sort of, you know, beginning to unravel in a sense at that point, and was sort of morphing into something different. But I still have a fascination with that Ireland, and it's a space that I still feel like I want to explore in other films.
As you were speaking about the detail, I'm sure that the cookie that Sean leaves on the table, that everybody has a different way of eating it, and then you are the one who eats it like this or like this.
That's a very famous biscuit in Ireland. So every Irish person knows that biscuit very well. It's a Kimberley biscuit. So that wasn't actually in Claire's original. I added that in, but it became a sort of a, yeah, it's probably the most famous sort of prop in the film, as it were.
Mogoče še kakšno vprašanje? Aha, prosim. Mikrofon je treba spet prižgati za publiko, prosim. Mogoče mikrofon za publiko ne dela, če se kaj da narediti.
Hi, sorry. I was going to ask, because there are some sequences in the film that you kind of go back to a few days before, or like with the sequence of her running, you show it a few times. This kind of like cutting back in time, or like, yeah, cutting between not necessarily two timelines, but kind of reminding us of certain moments. Was that already in the script? Or did you kind of give yourself the liberty to kind of play around with that in the edit? And was there maybe even a version of an edit that was even kind of more, not messed around, but like that was even more dynamic, those like cuts between, yeah, back and forth?
And are you talking about more dynamic, like within those sequences? Like within, say, the closing sequence when she's running and you're seeing the images?
Maybe if just like there was an edit where there was more of that, or like where that had a more significant role in like the dynamic of the film as a whole.
I wouldn't say there was an edit where there was more of it. But to answer your first question, it was definitely in the script. Like it's actually in the original in Foster. As she's running down the driveway, there are all these images that are filtering through her mind. You know, memories of things that have happened over that summer as she's rushing to Sean. So it was certainly always there. as a sort of a device. What maybe changed was like what the things that we chose for her to be remembering, you know, as she's running. Those things are probably slightly different than what was in the script, I would say. And really, you know, we did at one point, we played around with having none of them actually, where it was just her running and then she embraced Sean and so forth. And that worked well also, but there was something about it that was sort of robbing her of a little agency. It made her feel uh, um, more kind of helpless in a sense when you just saw her running and embracing him. Because I guess because we were losing that thing that was in the source material, which worked so well there, which is that it's illustrating in a sense how much this young girl has actually grown over the course of this summer. In that, you know, she's not running down that driveway to sort of beg the Kinsellas to like take her with them, or like to just to try and escape from this environment that she's been brought back to. She's running down that driveway to express her gratitude and to actually, in a way, tell these people that she loves them. And also acknowledge the pain that was involved for them in taking her, you know, that she became this sort of resurrected child for them over the course of that summer. And by having those moments, those images where you see the things that she received from the Kinsellas, and then you see the moments where she understood the sort of the pain that they were carrying, it just added to that sense of this being a gesture on her part that's born of an understanding that she's sort of stepped into young adulthood in a sense, and has had this sort of development psychologically and emotionally, that's allowed her to do this and to have the agency to do this, and to have come from this young girl who used to hide in the reeds to being this girl who's running for all of her life to actually express herself emotionally to these people, and then who's holding, in a sense, I always think it's like she's almost become like the adult, like she's holding Sean and he's almost like a child in a sense in that moment, and Eileen's almost like a child. She's the one crying in the car, and it's that you know, kind of bittersweet understanding that one gets when you kind of take those steps towards young adulthood, when you see the adults in your life as being vulnerable and as not having all the answers, or you know, being open to emotion in a way that you hadn't quite understood before. So yeah, it just felt to us like they were necessary, or that they were honoring, in a sense, this journey that she's been on, and this sort of new state of being that she's arrived at. But yeah, they were certainly in the script, and then it was a question of playing around with, you know, which ones exactly we would have used. But I don't think we ever had a version where there was like way more of those or anything like that. But yeah.
Yeah, no,
that answers your question
great
to some degree.
Yeah, no, it did. Because the other thing I was going to ask about was like very much what you were talking about, kind of translating that, I guess, internal imagery that's always described in books into a film that's so like obviously like the core of those scenes, and like kind of like the challenges that you had with that. But that, yeah, you answered all of that, so thank you.
But yeah, it's funny though. I mean, it is funny. You're right about, you know, books that are kind of written in the first person, and that are sort of in the mind of a character, they can often be sort of more amorphous in a sense, like, you know, Virginia Woolf or something. You know, they feel more difficult to grasp in a sense. But Claire's writing, I find, is very definite. She seems to me a writer who's very interested in images that are very concrete. And I've seen interviews with her where she's spoken about that she, as a writer, she needs these images. She calls them authenticating details. She needs that sort of, they're almost like crevices for her to grab onto as she's sort of climbing the cliff face of what she's doing, of her creation. And so when I was reading Foster, there were images that were just really striking to me, and that really stuck with me. And that style again felt really truthful to me in terms of how a child processes the world around them and how memories are formed. Like when I think back on my own childhood, my memories are often built around like a specific image, like and oftentimes a very small detail. So I was quite keen that the film would be open to those kinds of images being part of the texture of it, you know. So that's why you have quite a number of images that are just smaller details, but they're given a sort of a weight or a presence that maybe you mightn't, you know, other films mightn't necessarily allow for that. Particularly when there's an emotional context, like, because I think you know, memories kind of form in a much more solid way, particularly around like an image, if there is an emotional context to it. So for instance, like the scene when Coach is in the back of her father's car, and this mysterious woman sits into the car that she doesn't know, but she can tell that there's something kind of untoward about this dynamic between her father and this woman. And again, the camera stays with Catherine. It's always kind of in the back seat of the car. But I wanted to find an image that would sort of crystallize that memory for her in a way. And that image for me was just this one detail of the earring that this woman is wearing, this sort of this kind of deep pink colored earring. That's just this detail that she really kind of hones in on, and that I feel will always be the sort of defining image in a way of that memory for her, particularly because it has this emotional context to it where she felt something that was different from the ordinary kind of rhythm of life. And yeah, so you know, in a strange way, I think like the whole question of memory is really interestingly presented in Claire Keegan's Foster, because even though it's written in the first person and it's written in the present tense, it's not entirely clear whether it could technically be like a memoir. It could be written in what's called the historical present, you know, when you're describing the past, but you do so in writing in a present tense. And I was always fascinated by that, you know. And there are times when I kind of like to imagine that the film is itself a kind of collection of memories, of thoughts, that they're something that she's reflecting upon as an adult, and reflecting upon with a sort of an adult understanding of the value of what she received over the course of that summer, and the value of like even the kind of mundane aspects of that summer, and just the time that was spent with those caregivers, you know. So it's like you know, just peeling potatoes or walking to the well or eating together at the table, not necessarily speaking even, that there's real value to those moments, and there's a real value to those silences as well. I mean, they're all silent sort of activities that are observed in the film. So yeah, I do sometimes like to think that it's something that Coet is reflecting upon with an understanding of its value.
And film being such a perfect medium to capture this this instant of a memory. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Še kakšno vprašanje mogoče? As there are not any more questions, I would like to thank you very much for this talk, also of course for your film. It will be playing now, tudi vsi povejte še komu, če bo še kakšna projekcija, a ne? Thank you, and we're looking forward for your next film.
Thank you very
Probably
much.
so are you.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Thank you.